Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of September. Today's speaker is David Shiner, and David's title is The Stoic Approach to Happiness. Please note that this presentation is also being recorded and it'll be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during this presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type into the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I'll pose them to David at the end of the lecture in our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. David and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. David's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. The Basic Program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there's no substitute for direct engagement with big ideas in their original texts. Through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture and a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Most of our classes still take place remotely, although this autumn we will offer a small number of courses in person downtown. Registration for all courses is now open online and progressing rapidly. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on October 7, and the speaker will be Basic Program instructor Stephen Walker. Stephen's title is Pro-Social Relativism in Ancient Chinese Thought. The First Friday lecture series is back after taking the summer off, so we will see you monthly throughout the academic year. Next Tuesday, September 6th, online, we will have our final Basic Program, let's see here. Well, take my word for it. We'll have our final Basic Program information session for prospective students. We have an excellent marketing team at Graham, and it includes you. Word of mouth is how we grow, so tell your like-minded friends and family. There's a lot going on at Graham in general this month, so do check out the events page on the Graham website. Of special note, this coming Tuesday, September 6th at noon, we will be having an online open house with Dean Seth Green. Navigate your way to our website to RSVP for that, and I'll see you there. Also, you will be interested in an online discussion with Fred Beitler. Fred will discuss the recent history of midterm elections on Monday, September 12th. Finally, an information session on a new Graham course called Dimensions of Diversity will be held on Tuesday, September 13th. Please see the Graham School website for details, as well as for the rest of a robust roster of events. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. David Shiner is Professor Emeritus at Shimer College, now the Shimer Great Book School at North Central College, where he taught for 40 years and served several terms as Dean of the college. At Shimer, Professor Shiner taught all 16 required courses on subjects as distinct as literature, chemistry, psychology, and politics. He has also taught at other colleges, as well as at Great Discourses, an online provider of high-quality non-credit courses. He has written on the dialogues of Plato, the philosophy of the French Enlightenment, game theory, economics, and paradox. His non-academic activities include chess, acting, musical performance, and sports. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Pacific Miramar University. He has a special interest in classics, especially classical philosophy. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to David.
Well, thank you very much, Kendall. Thanks for that introduction and welcome everyone. Going to do quite a bit of screen sharing here today. So today I'm going to be talking with you about ancient Stoicism, and particularly about the Stoic approach to happiness, which of course is the title of this lecture. Now, to begin with, I realize that for some of you, the phrase the Stoic approach to happiness might sound like an oxymoron. Because nowadays, folks tend to think of Stoics as people who are pretty much emotionless or believe that showing emotions is bad or something of that sort. They might look like this. And I will, okay, let's see. There we go. But that view doesn't accurately reflect the beliefs or actions of the ancient Stoics. Those folks did, in fact, believe that certain emotions, like fear and anger, should be avoided. But they actively encouraged other emotions, as I'll explain later on. And they believed that those more desirable emotions would arise naturally from a life that was well lived. As the Roman Stoic Seneca wrote some 2,000 years ago in an essay appropriately entitled On the Happy Life, anyone who practices Stoic principles, quote, must, whether he wills it or not, necessarily be attended by constant cheerfulness and a joy that's deep and issues from within, since he finds delight in his own resources and desires no joys greater than his inner joys. So today I'll be talking about what those inner joys are, how the Stoics thought you could achieve them, and how the Stoic approach to happiness is related to a life well lived. So a little history. Stoicism had its origins in the 3rd century BC. It was one of several Greek philosophic movements that followed Platonism and Aristotelianism, which began in the previous century. It originated with a man named Zeno. Now, you might be familiar with Zeno because of these well-known paradoxes, but this is not that Zeno. That Zeno was Zeno of Elea, the Zeno you're familiar with. He was a contemporary of Plato. This was a different Zeno. He lived about a century later, and he hailed from Citium in modern-day Cyprus. And we think he looked like this. Zeno's father was a merchant. He would return home from his travels with books for his son to read, as a result of which Zeno developed an interest in philosophy, and especially in works about Socrates. Later on, as an adult, he was shipwrecked and found himself stranded in Athens. According to ancient commentators, Zeno went to a bookseller and asked where he could find a man like Socrates in Athens. Just then, a famous and highly respected philosopher named Crates was walking by, and the bookseller told Zeno to follow him. So Zeno did. And he subsequently studied with Crates, the Cynic, for several years. This led him to a life devoted to philosophy. He's quoted as later having said, "I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck." So Crates, Zeno's teacher, was a member of the Cynic school of philosophy. Cynicism meant something a little different than it does now. It was the shunning of conventional values, including worldly pleasures. The Cynics argued that human beings had developed unnatural values. As an example, one prominent Cynic pointed out that a useless statue, which only has aesthetic appeal, costs many times as much as a cup of barley flour, which can keep a human being alive. The Cynic philosophers were ascetics. Many of them lived in the streets and slept on the ground in public. Zeno found some aspects of the views of the Cynics to be compelling, but he came to believe that they lacked sufficient understanding of nature as well as philosophic depth, both of which I'll be talking about a little later. So he eventually went off to study with several non-Cynic philosophers before founding his own school in Athens. The members of that school were originally called Zenonians in honor of Zeno, but they eventually became known as Stoics. The name Stoic derives from a porch in the public square in Athens that was decorated with mural paintings. That's what the word means. It's thought to have looked something like this. This is where Stoic teachers such as Zeno lectured and members of the school congregated. When Zeno died, he was succeeded as head of the Stoic school in Athens by a man named Cleanthes, who had come to Athens from Assos in Asia Minor. Cleanthes, in turn, was later followed by Chrysippus, the third head of the school, who also hailed from Asia Minor. And this is what we think Cleanthes and Chrysippus looked like. You'll notice that we don't know exactly when they were born or died. With Chrysippus, we don't even have an estimate of when he was born. And that's a sign of the times in which they lived, of course, and how little historical information has survived about them. But we do know that all of them wrote extensively on the principles of Stoicism. Chrysippus is recorded by later commentators as having written several hundred books. But we only have scattered fragments of their compositions because, as is true of many of the works of the ancient Greeks, they've almost entirely been lost. In fact, we don't possess a single complete work by any of the first three heads of the Stoic school, Zeno, Cleanthes, or Chrysippus. We know of their works almost exclusively due to extensive commentaries on them by later scholars, such as the 3rd century AD author Diogenes Laertius, who had access to most of their writings. Still, the commentaries that have survived are comprehensive enough to give us a good idea of the views of Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and their successors. Zeno, like a number of philosophers who preceded him, taught that there was a threefold division of areas of philosophic inquiry. Logos, which we would translate roughly as logic, physis, from which our word physics comes, and that's loosely translated as nature, and ethike, which is, of course, ethics. How are we to live? He thought that anyone who is deciding how best to live their life should ideally be able to prove that that way of living was preferable to all others. In order to do that, he believed, they needed to understand nature, which the Stoics defined broadly to include the nature of the cosmos, of human beings, of animals, of the gods, and so on. They also needed to be adept at logic, so that, among other things, they could validly infer the consequences of a correct understanding of nature. Taken together, Zeno believed, those disciplines would provide a sound foundation for human thought and action, which is to say, ethics. Diogenes Laertius quoted the Greek Stoics as using the metaphor of a fertile garden for the Stoic understanding of philosophy. I don't know how well you can see this, but I hope you can. This is the Stoic garden. This is the metaphor. Nature, right, physics, is the soil. Right? Logic, the ability to correctly understand the meanings of words, to distinguish truth and falsity, valid arguments, defends us from bad reasoning. And that's the fence that protects the Stoic garden from basically invasive species. And then the crop is ethics, what it's all about, the study of good living, how we should live, and the practice of doing that. The Stoics believe that once we study nature, apply logic, and draw the appropriate consequences for our actions in the world, we'll be transformed into a life of virtue. To again quote Seneca, quote, "Philosophy is nothing else than a right way of living, or the science of living honestly, or the art of living a good life," unquote. In other words, the crux of Stoic ethics is knowing what living virtuously means and applying that knowledge in one's life. So we have good evidence that the earliest Stoics were highly regarded by the Athenian public. Since the Stoics gathered, discussed, and taught philosophy in a public place, the general tenor of their views became widely known. Ordinary, everyday Greek citizens in the 3rd century BC probably didn't know much, if anything, about the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. But Zeno the Stoic, Zeno of Citium, had a statue raised to him in Athens at public expense. And here's the inscription to that statue, or the beginning of the inscription. "Whereas Zeno of Citium, son of Nisus, Niceas, has for many years been devoted to philosophy in the city and has continued to be a man of worth in all other respects, exhorting to virtue and temperance those of the youth who come to him to be taught, directing them to what is best, affording to all in his own conduct a pattern for imitation in perfect consistency with his teaching. It has seemed good to the people, and may it turn out well, to bestow praise upon Zeno of Citium, the son of Niceas, and to crown him with a golden crown, according to the law, for his goodness and temperance, and to build him a tomb in the Ceramicus at the public cost. And the rest of the inscription just talks about how this is going to be done logistically. Of course, the citizens of Athens couldn't and wouldn't have honored Zeno for a life lived in accordance with his philosophic principles, unless those principles were at least somewhat known to the general public. In part, this admiration seems to have come about because Stoicism helpfully addressed questions that most people were concerned with, including matters like death, suffering, power, poverty, and it still does, as we'll talk about later on. So now let's discuss the principles of early Stoic philosophy, beginning with their theory of knowledge. I'm sure most of you who know something about Stoic ethics would like to dive right in there, but I think it's important to offer a brief account of other aspects of the Stoic philosophy, the other two areas, nature and logic. According to the early Stoics, again, we're talking about Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, the first teachers of Stoicism in Athens in the 3rd century BC. Knowledge acquisition begins with impressions. That is, how things present themselves to our senses. For example, as I look at my computer screen, I find that I'm presented with manifold impressions. I infer from those impressions that a few hundred human beings are tuned into this lecture. That might in fact be true, and of course I hope it is, but it might not, because we can easily devise various alternative explanations for this particular visual phenomenon. Some of those explanations might strike us as far-fetched or even frankly ludicrous, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're false. We might not have any choice about whether we receive a given impression or presentation, as some Stoics called it, but we do have the choice of deciding whether to accept that impression or presentation as being a true representation of reality. The Stoics believe that our impressions or presentations must be subjected to rational judgment before they can count as knowledge, and that it's within our power as rational beings to correctly give assent or denial to any impression. The later commentator Diogenes Laertius explained that further with these words. A presentation or mental impression is an imprint on the soul, the name having been appropriately borrowed from the imprint made by the seal upon the wax. There are two species of presentation, the one apprehending a real object, the other not. The former, apprehending a real object, they take to be the test of reality. It's defined as that which proceeds from a real object, agrees with that object itself, and has been imprinted, seal fashion, and stamped upon the mind. The latter, or non-apprehending, that which does not proceed from any real object, or if it does, fails to agree with the reality itself, not being clear or distinct. So we can think of things like dreams, fantasies, daydreams, that kind of thing. But we can also think about stuff like a stick bending in water, being very careful to rationally analyze our impressions and understand what reality is. So according to the early Stoics, when we have an impression or presentation that reveals the world as it really is, and we recognize it as such, we can truly be said to have acquired knowledge. And as Diogenes Laertius wrote in what I just read, such knowledge comes about when we correctly ascertain that the impression or presentation is clear and distinct. So, if we all have an abundance of reason, which all the Stoics thought we did, and if reason can distinguish truth from falsity, why are we wrong so often? Well, according to the Stoics, we human beings have a problem. And briefly stated, that problem is our emotions. Again, that doesn't mean that all of our emotions are problematic, but many of them are, those which we might refer to as the unhealthy emotions. This chart represents one account of the Stoic view of the emotions. Different Stoics put them in somewhat different categories, but this is one generally accepted account of them. Or as they're called here, the passions. The words are used interchangeably. So on the left side are the things we should be avoiding: pain, fear, craving or lust, and pleasure. The Stoics thought all of these are products of irrational thinking. As you can see, the word irrational is at the beginning of the last three. And they equated them with mental disturbance. They believed that a rational person would eliminate them, so to try to achieve apatheia, or apatheia, which is at the bottom here, which is something like equanimity, tranquility of mind, right? The things that Zeno was lauded for in the inscription to the tomb. This would come about through a life lived in accordance with reason and virtue, which gives us the healthy counterparts on the right-hand side, which, as you can see, caution instead of fear, a rational aversion of vice, wishing, a rational desire for virtue, and joy, a rational elation over virtue. Again, you see the words rational and virtue being among the healthy emotions or passions. So I'll be talking in more detail about Stoic virtue later on, and what the virtues actually were, as opposed to the passions that are to be avoided or aimed for. But I'll say now that they emphasize internal goods, what we might call states of character. The Stoics held that external things are neither good nor bad in themselves. Valuing external goods is therefore to be avoided, as doing so either stems from or results in unhealthy emotions. When you looked at this chart, you may have thought, yeah, we should try to avoid pain, fear, and craving. I can get the but pleasure. How about that? But for the Stoics, they'd say if you value external goods, you're going to get pleasure, or you think you'll get pleasure from winning the lottery, right? But the Stoics believe that any form of pleasure based on such external events or external goods, as the Stoics would say they're wrongly labeled as goods, is illusory. And if you've ever seen any studies of people who've won the lottery, you might be inclined to agree. Still, all of our emotions come about in this way, and most of those that are to be avoided, like fear and craving, have counterparts that are to be cultivated by means of thinking rationally and acting virtuously. And that doesn't result in pleasure, but the Stoics thought in happiness. Of course, this conception of happiness is very different from the way we normally use the term nowadays. We generally think of happiness as something representing something like a feeling. I'm feeling happy today, whereas the Stoics, like most educated Greeks who addressed the subject, regarded it as a state of the well-tempered soul, one representing its highest good. Like Aristotle and most other ancient Greek philosophers, the Stoics viewed happiness as the goal of human life, although there was a great deal of disagreement among the various philosophic schools about what happiness consists in. For the Stoics, of course, it results from acting virtuously, which means acting according to the dictates of reason, as we've seen. And it also means living according to nature. Now, the idea that living well means living according to nature was common to all the Greek schools of that period. Unlike many of the schools, though, the Stoics believed that living according to nature meant conforming one's thoughts and actions to the nature of the cosmos, or what for them amounted to the same thing, to the laws of nature. They, like many, if not most educated Greeks, believe that the world of nature is permeated by mind or reason at the highest level. So the Stoics believe that the cosmos is not only rational, but also orderly and benign. As rational beings ourselves, albeit far lesser ones, we humans are able to comprehend this, which means we're able to recognize the great power and wisdom that not only rules the cosmos, but in some sense is the cosmos. Thus, for the Stoics, acting naturally involved not only being rational and benign ourselves, but also conforming our will to the divine will, which meant conforming it to nature, properly understood. Zeno believed that every human being has a daemon, a kind of an inner genius or purpose, and it connects us to the universal nature. That's what he thought as being part of being human. He challenged his students to progress to the point where everything they did was in harmonious accord with the will of the gods who govern the universe, thus allowing them to live fully in accordance with nature. Living this way, Zeno taught, was the very definition of happiness. Of course, he and his fellow Stoics believed that happy people are also virtuous, since those qualities are intrinsically connected. Zeno's successor, Cleanthes, held that each of us is born with all the seeds of virtue within us. He called human beings, he characterized us as like half-completed poems, whose task in life is to complete our poem. Later on, Antipater, who was the sixth head of the Stoic school in Athens, so about 100 years later, thought that virtue consists, quote, in choosing continually and unswervingly the things which are according to nature and rejecting those that are at odds with nature, contrary to nature. So much for the early Stoic view of nature. Now I want to talk just a little bit about the second area of study, logic, which is characterized as the protective fence of the fertile garden of Stoicism. We've already seen the importance of the Stoic logic and the theory of knowledge acquisition, which they regarded as a branch of logic. Nowadays, we call this epistemology. The Stoics not only employed the sort of formal logic that had been developed by earlier philosophers, notably Aristotle, but in some respects, they improved on it. They were especially dedicated to the syllogism, which is a form of argument that yields true conclusions if its premises are true. So here's a classical Aristotelian syllogism. Everything in category A is also in category B. That's premise number one. Premise number two, everything in category B is also in category C. Therefore, in other words, we can conclude from those two premises that everything in category A is also in category C. Pretty simple, right? That's a very basic Aristotelian syllogism. So here's an example. All elephants, that's category A, are mammals, category B. All mammals, category B, are animals, category C. Therefore, all elephants are animals. Now, probably we didn't need a syllogism to figure that one out, but I just wanted to give a real simple one to give you an idea of how this works. And of course, what's important isn't the example, but the form. The Aristotelian syllogisms were limited in that everything was about categories, or you might have said classes, right? You have to be part of a class, the class of things with property A, the class of things with property B, so forth, right? There's nothing about individual things in any of these syllogisms, and that's for reasons that are beyond the scope of this lecture. The Stoics added syllogisms that involved individuals as well as classics. Here's one. This is an actual syllogism from Zeno of Citium. That which is rational is better than that which is non-rational. Nothing is better than the cosmos. Therefore, the cosmos is rational. Okay? Now, whether or not you accept those premises or that conclusion, right, this is also a demonstration of the fact that the Stoics effectively tried to prove almost everything that they claimed. A lot of this, the cosmos is rational and so forth, sounds just like a bunch of dogmatic claims, but in fact, the early Stoics had proofs, or what they regarded as proofs, for most of them. So this syllogism could be the form of it, right, of this particular syllogism from Zeno goes like this. Everything in category A, that which is rational, is better than everything in category not A, all the things that are non-rational. X, the cosmos, is better than everything else. Therefore, X, the cosmos, is in category A, rational things. So the ancients referred to these sorts of arguments as, and again, argument, we're not talking about putting up your dukes, we're talking about, right, a logical argument, philosophic argument, as demonstrations. We normally think of demonstrations as showing something, like what I'm doing with the PowerPoint. But for logically inclined Greeks, such as the Stoics, it referred to a valid form of reasoning. The syllogism, according to Diogenes Laertius, quote, contributes much to the formation of correct judgments, unquote, which in turn gives, quote, a scientific character to our conception of things. A scientific in the sense of episteme, of ancient Greek, in other words, that it truly gives it a character of this is real knowledge. And some Stoic innovations in formal logic are still used today, but I recognize that lecturing about logic is not the most exciting thing for most people to hear about. So I'm going to leave the subject there and just give you that little snippet. So we've talked about the two of the three areas of Stoic philosophy, early Stoic philosophy, the Greeks, nature and logic. The emphasis on ethics, which is what most of you would know about Stoicism today, if you know things about it, if you've heard about it, became the hallmark of the later Stoics, such as Seneca, who I mentioned earlier, and others who I'm going to introduce you to in a few minutes. They flourished during the early period of the Roman Empire, and that emphasis is the main reason the Stoics are still studied and to some extent followed even today. So the virtues, I promised to tell you a little bit more about them. We're going to go to there. Aristodemus was one of two major Stoic advisors to the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. And he wrote the most complete surviving list of the Stoic virtues. These are, again, various Stoic philosophers might have characterized them a little differently, but this is a very good sort of consensus view of the virtues, Stoic virtues. First, wisdom, phronesis, which is knowledge of what to do and not to do, right? Leading us to act appropriately. This includes qualities like soundness of judgment, circumspection, and ingenuity. Second, sophrosune, which is temperance or moderation. And that is knowledge of what things are and aren't worth choosing. This includes attributes like modesty, orderliness, and most especially self-control. Dikaiosune, justice, is the knowledge of how to fairly apportion what is due to each being in each situation. Under this heading, the Stoics placed virtues like piety, kindness, and fellowship, right? And the reason I put being as opposed to each person is piety is what we owe to the gods, who are a different kind of being, kindness and fellowship to each other. And finally, Andrea, courage, is the knowledge of what's terrible and what isn't. And this category includes qualities like perseverance, intrepidness, and stout-heartedness. And although I'm not going to show them, there are also four primary vices, which are the opposite of the virtues, things like injustice and cowardice. Easy to figure those out. So these virtues were referenced and extolled in varying degrees, by the Roman Stoics who lived after Aristodemus. We know this because, unlike in the case of the earlier Stoics, the Greek Stoics, we possess a number of complete or nearly complete works by Roman Stoics, particularly Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. There were other influential Stoics during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, including Epictetus' teacher, Musonius Rufus, who I'm going to quote later on. But those were the big three, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. And that spans almost 2 centuries of, first 2 centuries of the Common Era, though, after death, AD. I'll give a little biographical information on each of them, and then I'll talk about their contributions to Stoicism. So we'll start with Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who we don't know exactly when he was born. We know it was before the birth of Christ, but probably very shortly before. We do know he died in 65 AD. He was born in Spain just before the turn of the millennium and was actively, as an adult, actively involved in politics. And he was also a successful playwright and investment banker. Later in life, he became an advisor to the Emperor Nero. His influence and counsel were credited with keeping the many unsavory aspects of Nero's character in check for the first few years of his reign. But eventually, Seneca, like virtually all of Nero's competent advisors, fell out of favor with the emperor. After he retired from the court, some of the counselors who replaced him, none of whom could accurately be described as a Stoic, persuaded Nero that Seneca had been involved in a conspiracy against him. As a result, Nero ordered Seneca to commit suicide. So he did. And according to ancient reports, he behaved in a manner befitting a Stoic, that is, without displaying any of the so-called unhealthy emotions. In fact, it's written that when friends who were present while he was preparing to die wept over his fate, Seneca, like Socrates in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, which those of you who've done the basic program will remember, reprimanded them for acting in an unstoical manner. Excuse me. Seneca was a prolific writer. He authored a number of tragic plays and several scientific treatises. The treatises mostly haven't survived, but the others mostly have, and quite a few letters, dialogues, and essays. All those that have survived, and we presume those that haven't, are firmly Stoic in content, and they're what Seneca's most remembered for today. And most of his writings, like those of the Roman Stoics, are widely available in English translation. So on to Epictetus. We know very little about this man's early life, other than that he was born into slavery a few years before the death of Seneca, sometime between 50 and 60 AD. In his youth, Epictetus was the property of a man named Epaphroditus, who was a secretary to Nero and held a similar position under subsequent rulers. While Roman attitudes and behavior towards slaves varied considerably, the Romans generally valued those who showed signs of intelligence and initiative, both of which Epictetus had in good measure. Such slaves would be allowed to hold positions as teachers, counselors, and administrators. Epictetus was reportedly exposed to philosophy early in life. As a young man, we're told he would ask random people, is your soul healthy? Somewhat in the manner of Socrates. By the way, if you're getting the impression that the Stoics regarded Socrates as an almost godlike figure, you've got the right idea. At some point in his early adulthood, for reasons that have been lost to history, Epictetus obtained his freedom. He began a school of philosophy in Rome, then later moved it to Nicopolis in what is now Western Greece, where he remained for the rest of his life. He was the most respected Stoic teacher in the Roman Empire at that time, and he was visited by many dignitaries, including the Emperor Hadrian. Epictetus's death occurred sometime during Hadrian's reign, which lasted from 117 until 138 AD. And as far as we know, he never wrote anything. His conscientious student Arrian faithfully recorded his lectures and preserved them for posterity. The most popular work of his that we have is a very small, readily available and accessible book called the Enchiridion, or Handbook. Enchiridion means ready at hand, so the handbook. We also have the first 4 of reported 8 books of a much longer work, the Discourses, or the Discourse of Epictetus, of which there are also a number of English translations in print. So now Marcus Aurelius. Like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius showed exceptional promise from an early age. Unlike the former slave, however, Marcus hailed from a distinguished family. When the Emperor Hadrian, who I just mentioned in connection with Epictetus, chose Marcus's uncle, Antoninus Pius, as his successor to the throne, Antoninus, in turn, adopted the teenage Marcus Aurelius, which meant that he was in line to eventually become the Roman emperor. And that came to pass more than 20 years later. Aurelius, we're told, undertook his duties in exemplary fashion. For example, in order to finance the endless series of defensive wars that took place during his reign, Marcus auctioned off imperial possessions so he wouldn't have to raise taxes on the Roman people. He showed unparalleled respect to the Roman Senate, even asking for its approval in some situations where he wasn't legally obliged to do so. In one remarkable speech, Marcus informed the Senate that his reason for consulting them about court finances was that the imperial palace wasn't his, it was theirs. He was widely and almost universally venerated for his rulership, after which, unfortunately, the decline of the Roman Empire began. Like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius wrote nothing for publication. Everything we know about his philosophy comes from his diary, which in published form is usually translated Meditations. Sometimes it's called To Himself because it was a diary, but often the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He didn't actually give it a name. Most of us don't give our diaries a name. The entries in his diary are very short, often only a sentence or two, and they reflect a sort of serious introspection that was typical of the writings of all the Roman Stoics. His diary, taken together with the writings of Seneca and the lectures of Epictetus, give us a clear picture of the essentials of Roman Stoicism. To give you some idea what those essentials were, here's a snippet from Epictetus. It's the very first paragraph of the Enchiridion, the handbook, and it runs like this. Some things are in our power, other things are not. In our power are opinion, movement, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our acts. Not in our power are the body, property, reputation, offices, and in a word, whatever are not our own acts. And the things in our power are by nature free, not subject to restraint or hindrance. But the things not in our power are weak, slavish, subject to restraint in the power of others. Remember then, that if you consider the things which are by nature slavish to be free, and the things which are in the power of others to be your own, you will be hindered, you will lament, you will be disturbed, you will blame both gods and men. But if you consider only that which is really your own to be your own, and if you consider that what is another's, as it really is, belongs to another, no one will ever compel you. No one will hinder you, you will never blame anyone, you will accuse no one, you will do nothing against your will. No one will harm you. You will have no enemy, for you will not suffer any harm. Now, generally speaking, this celebrated passage reflects the views of the earlier Greek Stoics, but it's stated more starkly, right? And almost personally, you, right, comes a lot. And this is true of all these folks that I read, that I mentioned, although with Marcus Aurelius, you generally means to himself. The only things that should matter to us are internal ones, those in our minds, for those are the only ones we can control. Valuing or craving external goods is an illusory means of attaining happiness, since those things are not in our power, and thus we have no sure means of either gaining or retaining them. And you'll recognize this from what I said earlier about the Greek Stoics. And this is closely related to the issue of happiness in the Stoic sense, which Epictetus makes clear in numerous other passages, of which this is an example. Eagerly anticipating some future event, passionately imagining something you desire, looking forward to some happy scenario, as pleasurable as those things might seem, they ruin your chances of happiness in the here and now. Locate that craving for more, better someday, and see it for what it is, the enemy of your contentment. Choose it or your happiness. They are incompatible. It is quite impossible to unite happiness with a craving for what we don't have. Happiness has all that it wants, and resembling the well-fed, there shouldn't be hunger or thirst. So this issue of choice comes in. Choose it, craving, or happiness. And Epictetus observed elsewhere that if you hold anything dear outside of your own reasoned choice, your own rational choice, you will have destroyed your capacity for choice. This reflects the Stoic belief that the capacity for choice, that is, the human will, is much stronger than we might think. Seneca argued in the typical passage, nature has given us enough strength if we use it. And here's what Marcus Aurelius had to say about this. When you're distressed by an external thing, it's not the thing itself that troubles you, but only your judgment of it. And you can wipe this out in a moment's notice. Here as elsewhere, the Roman Stoics expressed confidence that our natural internal resources are sufficient for all our needs, just as Zeno and Cleanthes had maintained centuries earlier. As Seneca put it, the greatest blessings of mankind are within us and within our reach. A wise man is content with his lot, whatever it may be, without wishing for what he has not. The Stoics regarded those blessings, the greatest blessings of mankind, as gifts from the gods to us, which is one of the reasons why we should be grateful to them. As Seneca put it, in all things, we should try to make ourselves as grateful as possible. Unquote. Our unhealthy emotions might induce us to blame the gods when something happens that we regard as bad. But this attitude, according to both early and later Stoics, is irrational and therefore mistaken. Epictetus counseled this: whenever you find yourself blaming providence, turn it around in your mind, and you'll see that what has happened is in keeping with reason. So if what has happened is our fate, the province of the unerring gods, then our task in this life consists in accepting our fate, regardless of what it is, content with our lot, as Seneca says here. Not only should we accept this, we should absolutely revel in it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal, love the hand that fate deals you and play it as your own. What could be more fitting? So now let's shift our attention from our proper attitude toward the gods and to fate to our attitude toward our fellow human beings. The Stoics' definition of humans as rational beings led them to a conception of the human community that was remarkably broad for its day, including, at least for some, women and slaves. While there's no hint in Stoic writings of support for the freeing of slaves, who after all were presumably put in their roles by the gods, there's clear advocacy for treating all men as brothers in other respects. As Seneca wrote, and I've got it here, top quotation here, nature bids me to be of use to other humans, whether they're slave or free, freedmen or freeborn. Wherever there's a human being, freedman means someone who was originally slave and then was freed, as Epictetus was. Wherever there's a human being, there's room for benevolence. And Epictetus put it maybe even more strongly: won't you keep in mind who you are, the bottom quote here, and who these people are whom you're ruling over, that they belong to the same family, that they're by nature brothers of yours, that they're the offspring of Zeus. Concerning women, Musonius Rufus, lecturing to his students, I mentioned he was Epictetus' teacher, lecturing to his students, was asked this question about whether women should do philosophy, and here was part of his response. Women have received from the gods the same rationality as men have, and it is this that we use among ourselves, and in accordance with what we think about every matter, whether it's good or bad, whether it's honorable or shameful. Further, the desire for and affinity to virtue are not limited to men, but also occur in women, for they, no less than men, are naturally pleased by honorable and just actions and censure their opposites. So from our common human nature as rational beings, the Roman Stoics derived the common good, the good of the entire human community. Marcus Aurelius in his diary makes more than 80 references to this, actually to the common good, and he relates this to the notion that we're all children of the gods and therefore all related. He observes that each of us has been made by nature for the purpose of working with others. And that carries serious implications for how we should behave toward all of our fellow human beings. We're expected to do right by them, regardless of any hope or expectation of external rewards. As he wrote, we were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the two rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. The issue of anger as an unhealthy emotion comes up often in the words of the later Stoics. But Stoic education and discipline went far beyond the rejection of anger. It involved the realization that all the unhealthy emotions or passions are due to incorrect judgments, and that we have the capability in our will to act on that insight and reject those unhealthy emotions. To the Roman Stoics, this involved, among other things, preparing ourselves mentally for the most outwardly painful events that can befall us. As Seneca wrote, day by day, you must keep before your eyes death and exile and everything else that seems frightening, but most especially death. And then you'll never harbor any mean thought, nor will you desire anything beyond due measure. And Epictetus would ask his students on the left-hand side, do you then ponder how the supreme of human evils, the surest mark of the base and cowardly, is not death, but the fear of death? I urge you to discipline yourself against such fear. Direct all your thinking, exercises, and reading this way, and you will know the only path to human freedom. And how does one undertake that discipline? Well, Epictetus gives several pieces of advice, including the one on the right. If you kiss your child or your wife, say to yourself that it's a mortal that you're kissing. And then if one of them should die, you won't be upset. Now, that might seem really unfeeling, maybe even callous to us, just as we look at that. And it's not because Epictetus didn't think familial affection was important. As he wrote about getting rid of our unhealthy passions, quote, I should not be free of passions in the manner of a statue, unquote, and went on to say that we're especially called to love those who are kin to us, such as our parents, siblings, and children. And Musonius Rufus, his teacher, positively extolled the virtues of love, especially the mutual love of husband and wife, calling it, quote, the most revered of all, unquote. So the practice recommended by Epictetus in this quote on the right, quotation on the right, was not intended as a way of disparaging that love, but rather as a helpful reminder that the people we love won't be with us forever. Something could have already happened to deprive us of them, but so far it hasn't. But they'll be gone someday, just as we will. Reminding ourselves of their mortality can be a way of not only acknowledging that death is natural and therefore not an evil, but also of cushioning the blow for when it inevitably happens. As Seneca put it, fortune falls heavily on those for whom it's unexpected. The one on the lookout easily endures. In addition, the practice recommended by Epictetus can be a way of fostering gratitude for the fact that our loved one is with us in the here and now. When that's no longer the case, we'll be less likely to regret that we didn't love them enough when we had the chance. The Stoics believed consistently enough that we should be no more concerned about our own death than about the death of a loved one. At one point in the discourses, Epictetus finds himself in a rather witty, actually, dialogue with a man who is foolishly, in his estimation, bound up his external fate with that of an unsavory ruler. The man repeatedly tries to get Epictetus to commiserate with him about his situation and is rebuffed at every turn. Toward the end of the dialogue, the exasperated politician blurts out, but I'm under a death sentence. And Epictetus replies, and everyone else isn't? Recognition and acceptance of our own mortality is a cornerstone of Stoic ethics. As Epictetus put it, quote, I can't escape death, but at least I can escape the fear of it. This cartoon, which references Zeno of Citium, but could be about any of the ancient Stoics, sums up their attitude about death pretty well. Okay, so much for my account of classical Stoicism. Much more could be said, but I hope that's a helpful outline for you. For the final part of this talk, I'd like to offer a few remarks about modern day Stoicism. While Stoic epistemology and theology have long since been discarded, there's been substantial recent interest in ethical aspects of the Stoic way of life. This includes an annual, worldwide conference called Stoicon. It's been going on annually for about 10 years. Various popular blogs on Stoicism, and a number of 21st century books that have sold very well. Here are just a few of them. Ryan Holiday, a popular Stoic blogger, The Daily Stoic, 366 meditations on wisdom, perseverance, and the art of living. So one for each day with chapter introductions as well. William Irving, about 15 years ago, wrote, and you can't see the words here, but it's called A Guide to the Good Life, right? And it's all about a Stoic way of life. Massimo Pigliucci recently came up with a handbook for new Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control, along with the co-author, Gregory Lopez. And finally, Donald Robertson, one of his books is called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And I think you can guess who he's referring to there. Now, all four of these authors have written several popular books on Stoicism, besides those depicted here, as have quite a few other worthy authors. And there have been some very significant contemporary and near contemporary practitioners' Stoic ideals and values. And I'd like to introduce or reintroduce you to a few of them. Cognitive behavior therapy was developed by the psychologist Albert Ellis, and he was heavily influenced by the ancient Stoics. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on the premise that psychological problems are often due, at least partially, to faulty or unhealthy ways of thinking, and that people who recognize their fallacious thinking can learn better ways of thinking and thus live healthier and more fulfilling lives. Ellis taught this principle to his patients by showing a famous quote from Epictetus' handbook: "It's not events that upset us, but our judgments about events," right? His method of treatment involves helping patients learn to recognize when their judgments are distorted so they can amend those judgments in a healthier direction over time. A different aspect of Stoicism was developed and utilized by another psychologist, Viktor Frankl. And I'm sure many of you have read his beautiful book, Man's Search for Meaning, which has influenced several generations of readers with its powerful descriptions of life in Nazi death camps and its lessons for spiritual survival. Frankl spent a total of 3 years in 4 different concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and the Nazis killed his brother, his parents, and his pregnant wife. Based on those experiences and the experiences of others with whom he later treated in his therapeutic practice by means of what he called logotherapy, Frankl argued that while we cannot avoid suffering, we can choose how to cope with it, find meaning in it, and move forward in life with renewed purpose. As he wrote, and you see here, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. In other words, as the ancient Stoics counseled, we need to minimize our attention to our external circumstances in order to focus on the internal strength that all of us have within us and can access if we so choose. Late in his life, Nelson Mandela published a compendium of his letters, interviews, and other writings entitled Conversations with Myself, as you see on the upper right cover. According to his literary executor, Mandela's works were inspired most directly by Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which you'll recall Marcus also wrote to himself. This connection seems unusually fitting, although at the time when Mandela wrote most of the contents of the book, he could hardly have imagined that he, like Aurelius, would eventually become ruler of his country. The inspiration that Mandela derived from the meditation was mostly about the virtues and our ability and duty to cultivate them through introspection. In a 1975 letter from prison, for example, he wrote this: "Honesty, sincerity, simplicity, humility, pure generosity, absence of vanity, readiness to serve others, qualities which are within the easy reach of every soul, are the foundation of one's spiritual life. Development in matters of this nature is inconceivable without serious introspection, without knowing yourself, your weaknesses and mistakes." Marcus Aurelius couldn't have said it better. I suggest that at some point you look up this man, James Stockdale, if you don't know who he is, a man who was captured by the Viet Cong, tortured, lived in unimaginably brutal conditions for 7.5 years before he was released. He was a disciple of Epictetus, and I plan to tell you a little more about him, but we're getting toward the end, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. He wrote several books, Thoughts of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot on the right, Courage Under Fire, and basically credited his survival and his sanity to Epictetus. So these are some well-known people from the recent past whose stories are inspiring and were profoundly influenced by Stoicism. There are many others who aren't as well known. They were just ordinary, everyday people who demonstrated their Stoicism in how they lived their lives. One of them was a woman who wouldn't have seemed like a Stoic to most of those who knew her, at least as the common conception of Stoicism would have it. Here she is. She was cheerful, hardworking, almost unfailingly upbeat. In short, a lover of life. She was also a lover of classical philosophy, and Stoicism held a special appeal for her. The first time she heard Epictetus' statement that when you kiss someone you love, you should remind yourself that you're kissing a mortal, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "That's right, isn't it?" She enjoyed and profited from learning about Stoic principles and precepts, and over time, they became an increasing part of who she was. 4 years ago, this woman retired from her profession as a consultant to nonprofit organizations. Her Stoic forebears would have appreciated the fact that she continued to provide regular assistance to several such organizations without financial compensation or any other form of compensation, and also, perhaps, that she did a great deal of volunteer environmental work in recognition of her sense of connection with the natural world. And she looked forward to spending many more years doing those sorts of service, while also being aware in Stoic fashion that the externals of her life could change at any time. Just over a year after her retirement, she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. It was totally unexpected. She didn't smoke, and she was otherwise, excuse me, in perfect health for a woman in her late 60s. In fact, the cause of her disease was entirely unknown. But after some brief initial anxiety, she quickly came to accept her situation with Stoic equanimity. The morning after receiving her diagnosis, she told her husband, quote, "I've had a great life. Whatever else happens to me, I have no reason to complain," unquote. In discussing death, Seneca observed that a person, quote, "is never more divine than when contemplating his mortality and realizing that human beings are born for dying," unquote. Like his fellow Stoics, both Greek and Roman, Seneca believed that contemplating one's mortality under difficult circumstances should result in making reasonable efforts to preserve one's life, but not if the chances of a cure were minimal or if the pain became too great, since those things would curtail one's ability to be rational and to undertake virtuous activities. This woman acted in the way that Seneca and his colleagues had prescribed 2,000 years earlier. She opted to undergo various cancer treatments while telling her oncologist and her loved ones that if her physical condition became too debilitating, she would choose to terminate those treatments so she could die with dignity. 9 months later, with her physical pain having become almost constant and the likelihood of a medical cure growing increasingly dim, she chose to discontinue her treatments. She accepted the inevitable approach of death calmly, as befitted a Stoic fellow traveler. She concentrated on completing her considerable volunteer activities to the best of her declining abilities and to putting her affairs in order in the limited time she had remaining on this earth. Those who visited her during that final period of her life were profoundly moved by her serene acceptance of her fate and her continued concern for those whom she would still soon leave behind. She died peacefully a month later. She hadn't escaped death, but she'd escaped the fear of it. I'm grateful to have met and married such a remarkable woman. And I'm grateful for the ancient wisdom of Zeno, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and all the rest who did their best to teach both of us the Stoic approach to happiness. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, David. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And we have quite a queue of questions.
Really?
Yes, indeed. Let me, and the final remark from Mark Eleveld says, "Thank you, David. Very powerful." And I'm sure everyone in the room feels the same way. We'll go back to the first question. Comes from Ray Lucchese, who asks, shouldn't the Stoic syllogism, so he asked this as a 45-minute-old question at this point, shouldn't the Stoic syllogism end hypothesis B, therefore nothing is rational?
Well, let's take a look. Sorry. Okay. I will say that there seem to be some implicit premises, right, that are missing from this particular Stoicism, right? Nothing is better than the cosmos, therefore nothing is rational. So basically the idea here, I don't know if I'm answering your question, Ray, in the manner that you hope for. It presumes that there are rational things and there are non-rational things, right? That these categories actually exist, right? And if you weigh the rational and the non-rational, right, you weigh them all, you say, well, I'm sorry, that there are ranges of goods, right, I should say, right? And the cosmos is at the very top of that range, right? It's the best. Cosmos is the greatest, right? The nature of the cosmos is what the Stoics were all about, the early Stoics, right? So because of that, right, and because of, I would say, the implicit assumption that there are rational things and that there are non-rational things, right, that if nothing is better than the cosmos, right, it's got to be right at the top, namely in the rational group. So I hope that's helpful.
All right. Thank you, Ray, for your question. David Robbins says, that's so fallacious. It assumes, without stating it, that at least some things are rational.
Right. Yeah, I think I have the same answer to David as I did to Ray. Right. I mean, this is not, these presume categories that are non-empty sets, right? I mean, that's and I don't know, we don't have long lists of Zeno's syllogisms and what he would have done before this to get to this point. So this is kind of taken, I guess you could say, conceivably out of context. It's quite possible that somewhere else he develops that whole thing so that when he gets to this point, it all becomes clear because of earlier demonstrations. I don't know if that's true or if the Stoics were fairly sloppy considered to us, or accepting that there are that all sets, all meaningful sets, are of things that actually exist. Right. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David.
Yep.
Greg Gosick asks, Stoicism and Buddhism are philosophies with many similarities, yet their relative popularity significantly diverges, with the latter having many more adherents. Does Christianity, as a proximate competitor to Stoicism, contribute to this different outcome, and or what other reasons could account for it?
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. Certainly, there are striking similarities between many aspects of Stoicism and Christianity. And one could regard the later Roman Empire, after the time that I was referring to, as competition at some level, very basic, between Stoicism and Christianity, which Christianity won. Certainly Christianity would be, today we think of that as more of a counterpart to Buddhism. I imagine that the notion of a worldview with disciples for whom it was the essence of culture itself, as Buddhism historically was and Stoicism never was, plays a big part in that. And it could be, frankly, that Christianity and Buddhism appeal more to a fuller conception of human nature than Stoicism does. I mean, I think that's plausible, but that's all speculative, and that's a terrific question. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, David. Bud Gerstmann asks, if a person is an American, oh, I see. He's trying out the syllogism. If a person is an American, then he is probably not a member of Congress. This person is a member of Congress. Therefore, he is probably not an American. Let's see. So I'll look for the next one has a question mark. Ed Savage asks, how did a mindset of entitlement impact the Stoics and our current culture's pursuit of happiness?
So this is a question that has many aspects to it. Let me see can you actually reread that, Kendall? I want to make sure I'm addressing it well, appropriately.
How did a mindset of entitlement impact the Stoics and our current culture's pursuit of happiness?
Yeah, so our current culture, I would have to say, is not largely Stoic. And, I think you get to things like a culture of entitlement, and for some people, those are fighting words. But certainly what the ancient Stoics argued was against a culture of entitlement, and they certainly lived in one, right? This is not to say their culture was largely Stoic, right? They were continually having to show themselves to be virtuous as well as to profess virtue, and that it consisted in this. The Stoics I mentioned, if in fact external goods are meaningless, really, absolutely, as they said, just no valueless, then it really didn't matter if you were rich, poor, or somewhere in the middle, right? So we don't know if Epictetus was poor, but we presume he was never really rich. We know that Seneca was pretty rich, and at times apparently was criticized for it. If you're like, well, if you have, how can you be a Stoic and have so much wealth? And he said, look, Stoics don't believe you should or shouldn't have wealth, right? And he has one statement where he says, the difference between you and me, he's very direct, as Epictetus was in that one quote I showed you. He says, you are ruled by your riches, and I rule mine. And that was his view, right? That I don't have a sense of entitlement around this. If it's all taken away, I'm fine with it, right? But you are going to start lose your capacity for choice because you have these desires that are based on your value for material goods. I don't know how much more to say about a culture of entitlement, other than what in effect I've already said, which is that a culture of entitlement is contrary to a culture of gratitude in many ways. And the Stoics strongly believe in a culture of gratitude. And this is the issue about, the wise person is perfectly happy with whatever they have, right? They don't feel entitled to anything. If they wound up being a slave like Epictetus, that's fine. If they wound up being an emperor like Marcus Aurelius, that's fine. They live with that, and they don't particularly feel that way. But again, this is not the basics of how people thought in the Roman Empire. This is one very popular school from that period of time.
Thank you, David. The next question comes from George Perez, who asks, to be content, quote, with your lot seems to justify and maintain the class structures of the haves and have-nots, question mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So this, if that's the case, if you think that Stoicism is right, so let me put it this way: the notion of even helping your fellow man, fellow woman, whatever. So someone's down and out, they're poor and oppressed and so forth, right? How do you help them, right? What is this social conscience that Marcus Aurelius and others talked about, right? Well, you can do two things, right? One is you can give them a few drachma or whatever, or the other is you can lecture them on how they should be a better Stoic, right? And I don't know how many homeless folks there are around where you folks are watching, but I don't think lecturing them on how to be a better Stoic would probably be a really popular option. And the Stoics, from what I can tell, pretty much accept that that's the case, that we don't expect everyone to be a Stoic. We expect people to value things that are non-Stoic. We could hope for I suppose you could say, a more Stoic cosmos. But Marcus Aurelius's Meditations particularly are full of remarks about, people do not have the values that you have, right? And that most people just do not. And when you realize that, you have more of an empathy with them. You're not going to get angry with them. You're going to say, oh, they have different premises, right? Some of these popular works I'm mentioning, by the way, deal with this. The blogs deal with this quite a bit because it's kind of natural. The question that George asked is like, well, doesn't it mean it's all status quo and you're happy with your lot forever? Well, if you're a Stoic, yeah, right? If you're a Stoic looking at everybody else, well, maybe we could make some improvements around here. You might be called to make improvements, right? You're called to a way of life. Seneca, if he just thought everything was just leave everything the way it is, not only the class structure, he doesn't bother advising Nero, right? Because at some level, the extreme is you just leave everything the way it is. But that certainly is not what the Stoics preached.
Thank you, David. And on a related note, Dan P. asks, was the view of the common good of slaves and women as equals in value a central theme or a secondary theme?
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't call it a central theme. You have to kind of go looking for this stuff to find it, right? But I haven't found stuff really from the Roman Stoics that's seriously to the contrary, right? I mean, it follows that if you're part of this human community and really take that seriously, this is what happens. This is what the result of it is. But we just don't have very much on these topics, right? Marcus Aurelius never wrote about this. Generally, I gave you some quotes from Seneca and Epictetus on slavery that, look, we really mean this. This is really about all human beings. So it's not a central theme in the way that they're saying, hey, slaves and women, we want to remind you about this. They hardly ever talk about it. But when they do talk about it, at least in the passages that I showed, not many others, that's what's said.
Thanks, David. And I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. I have rather many here. Let me scan through here. Let's just take it in order then. Well, how about this? What were the ancients' criticisms of Stoicism? So this question comes from Bill Slankard.
Hi, Bill. Good to see you. So yeah, the ancients' criticisms, right? So you've got these competing schools in the ancient world, right? You have Stoicism. I mean, you've still got the remnants of Platonism and Aristotelianism. You've got Stoicism. You have Epicureanism. After Epicurus, those in the basic program will have read Lucretius's book on the nature of things or on the nature of the universe, depending how it's translated. Epicureanism is a strong contender against Stoicism. But so is cynicism, which I mentioned, which doesn't really do much with logic and nature, just kind of says, these are the values, they're to be shunned, it's all about ethics. And the skeptics, the academics, who didn't believe that any such thing as knowledge could be demonstrated. And they were constantly at the Stoics for, well, how do you know that any of these things are true? Right, the Stoics are saying, well, if you have the passage I showed from Diogenes Laertius about, oh, they have to be clear and distinct, and that's how you distinguish, true presentations or impressions from false ones. They're like, give us examples of those. And there are some fairly famous situations where a Stoic teacher would say, oh, here's one, and the skeptic would have had some trick up his sleeve to show that that wasn't really true. So that's part of it. The emphasis on formal logic. The Stoics were very, I mentioned that the Zeno who founded Stoicism was not the Zeno with the paradoxes, but he was, and the other Stoics from ancient Greece were very concerned about paradoxes, because if they couldn't be resolved, the question of how great logic was, right, for how airtight it was open to question, right? So could they solve these paradoxes? Some of their opponents were saying, the ways you're solving those paradoxes don't work, which undermined to some extent the validity of some logical, some formal logic. So there were quite a few different ways that if you look at the Epicurean view of life, that that everything is composed of atoms and matter and so forth, and we all dissolve into the universe and so forth. There are pretty obvious differences with the Stoics. So they get criticism through time. Even Cicero, who was a little earlier than the Romans I mentioned here, but was more or less a Stoic, would have criticisms in some of his works for Chrysippus. How can you say this? It doesn't work, right? So they tried to be self-critical. That is the Greek Stoics. The Roman Stoics, you just don't get that much interest in nature, and certainly in logic. You get very few things that could be called, here's a syllogism. So anyway, thanks. Those are some great questions.
Thanks a lot, David. And as I said in the chat, I'm now asking everyone to unmute so we can applaud our speaker. Sound of electronic applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And we hope to see you at our other events, and including the first Friday lecture of October. So have a great holiday weekend, everyone.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Is there any way we can continue learning from you?